Salary thieves who play on their computers will be fired. Charles, my elite boss, declared my dismissal, even though I'm the only engineer in the company. Apparently, he has harbored resentment toward me for always staring at my computer screen. However, I had already been considering leaving this company with such an awful boss, so I decided to grant his wish. Understood. I'll pack my things and leave the company. I gathered my belongings and left the company. But little did Charles know, a disastrous event was about to unfold for him. My name is Kevin, and I'm 30 years old. Currently, I'm the only engineer in the company. As a result, I spend most of my time looking at computer screens, but there was one person who didn't take it well. That was Charles, my boss, and the department manager. Kevin, stop messing around with your computer and serve everyone some coffee or tea. You're so inconsiderate. He barked orders at me, his temper flaring as usual. I had grown accustomed to such treatment. Understood. I'll bring some coffee or tea right away. With a sigh, I tore my eyes away from the monitor and headed to the break room. My colleagues remained absorbed in their work, oblivious to our exchange. Meanwhile, Charles smirked, clearly amused by my lack of resistance. Ignoring him, I left the office. In the break room, while preparing tea and coffee, I found myself lost in thought. I loved my job, but the lack of recognition made it hard to stay motivated. I'd considered quitting once before. But in our small company, my departure as the only engineer would cause a massive surge of bugs and chaos. If only there were someone to replace me, I'd leave this company in a heartbeat. Charles was the only one targeting me, so I stayed out of concern for my colleagues. I sighed deeply, frustrated with my inability to take action. By the time I noticed, the tea and coffee were ready. Carrying the tray back to the office, I felt a heavy weight in my steps. Although I was sick and tired of the sarcasm from Charles, but I could not bring myself to complain about him to the higher-ups. There is a clear distinction between Charles, the elite senior manager, and me, just an ordinary engineer. It is obvious at a glance without needing any further thought. Who would listen to someone like me? Feeling defeated, I let out another deep sigh. But one day, my life would take an unexpected turn. It happened the next day on the way home from work. Since I had neither a wife to cook for me nor even a girlfriend, I grabbed dinner from the convenience store, as usual. Hey, are you Kevin? Long time no see. Ah. A familiar voice called out to me while I was leaving the store to go home. When I turned around, there was Mark, a classmate I was close with in high school. Mark? Wow, it's really been a long time. How have you been? Yeah, it has. You look like you're doing well too. I never thought I'd run into you here. Mark approached me, clearly happy about our unexpected reunion. Since it had been years since we last saw each other, I was just as delighted. If I remembered correctly, Mark had transferred to a branch office in another state about 5 years ago. I'm the one who's surprised. Didn't you transfer to a branch office out of state? I did, but I just got transferred back to the headquarters recently. What about you? Still at the same job? Yeah, I've been working as an engineer there all this time. As I said this, the thought of Charles crossed my mind, and I instinctively averted my gaze. I wasn't sure what Mark made of my reaction, but he quickly changed the subject. Hey, how about we catch up properly over dinner tomorrow evening? It's been ages since we've had a drink together. He mimed holding a beer mug, flashing me a big grin, making it impossible to say no. Of course, I replied eagerly. Our offices were next to each other, so we agreed to meet after work in front of the buildings. You better show up. I'll be waiting. Mark, having secured an appointment, waved at me before leaving the scene. His sociable personality, unchanged since our high school days, still seems to shine. Seeing the familiar Mark brought back nostalgic memories, and I couldn't help but smile. Waving back at him, I also set off on my way home. Hey, Kevin. What do you mean by leaving on time without doing any overtime? The next evening, just as I was wrapping up work for the day, Charles called out to me with a scowl. I turned around, only to see him glaring daggers at me. It was clear he wasn't happy that I was leaving on time. Normally, he would complain about how useless I was and tell me to leave early, so why was he stopping me today? Maybe it was because I kept glancing at the clock. It's too late to regret that now. I needed an excuse to get out of this situation quickly. I've finished all my tasks for the day. Then help me or someone else with their work. Don't think you can leave on time just because you've been lazing around on your computer all day. Sensing he was about to force overtime on me, I mustered up my courage and said, I actually have plans tonight, so I'll be leaving now. What? Hey, wait a minute. Ignoring Charles's protests, I dashed out of the office. I had made sure to finish all my tasks to avoid any chance of being tied down by overtime, especially because of my plans with Mark. Even so, having to work overtime feels utterly unfair. I can't help but feel exasperated by Charles, who relentlessly piles on the overtime work without a second thought. When I stepped outside the company and looked back, there was no sign of Charles following me. I'd deal with the fallout tomorrow if I had to. For now, it couldn't be helped. Kevin, you made it. I'm so glad. Mark greeted me enthusiastically as we finally met up. We decided to head to a nearby pub for dinner. I couldn't remember the last time I'd gone to a pub with anyone, let alone enjoyed the company of a friend. So, let me cut to the chase. Did something happen at work? After about an hour of chatting and eating, Mark suddenly asked the question out of the blue. Mark continues his words, cutting in further as I stare at him in wide-eyed surprise. You seemed fine, but when you showed up earlier, you were out of breath like you'd been running. That's not like you. So I figured something might have happened. The concern in his eyes made my chest ache. I hadn't said anything, yet he'd noticed something was off. I felt guilty for worrying him. It's nothing major, really. After hesitating for a moment and lowering my gaze, I decided to confide in Mark. I told him about my strained relationship with my boss, Charles, and how I didn't feel fulfilled in my current job. Mark listened to me attentively, showing genuine concern. I see. In that case, here's an idea. Why don't you come work at my company? Huh? At your company? After hearing everything, Mark made such a surprising proposal. I was shocked, as I never imagined receiving a recruitment offer from our rival company next door. We're short-staffed too, honestly, but with your skills as an engineer, I think you'd be a great addition. I'll talk to my boss about it. So please think it over. At the very least, I'll make sure you're offered better terms than your current situation. Mark added that he wouldn't pressure me for an immediate answer. Our dinner ended after that. We had already exchanged contact information, and he asked me to let him know once I made a decision. Even as I headed home, I was in a daze, knowing I might never encounter another opportunity as good as this. Still, what weighed on my mind was the state of the company I'd leave behind. The workload from endless bugs would fall entirely on me, as no one else in my company was capable of handling them. With that in mind, I couldn't decide right away. But the moment of reckoning came sooner than I expected. The next morning, when I arrived at work, I saw Charles standing near the office door with a scowl, arms crossed. My heart sank. As soon as he spotted me, he stormed over with a face like demon. Kevin, you had the nerve to defy a direct order from your manager yesterday. But I had plans yesterday. There was nothing I could do. I can stay late today if needed. Though overtime wasn't mandatory, Charles probably saw me staring at my computer screen all day as laziness, which clearly irritated him. Caught off guard by Charles's authoritative manner, I responded cautiously. But Charles smirked, as if he'd been waiting for that very reply. Don't bother staying late anymore. A slacker like you glued to a computer screen all day is fired. What? The sudden announcement of my firing made me raise my voice in disbelief. That couldn't be right. I began to wonder if Charles even had the authority to fire me. Fired, huh? The other staff arriving at the office overheard the exchange and turned their attention to us, whispering among themselves. Rather than intervening, they seemed too intimidated by Charles's authority to say a word. No one stood up for me or tried to stop him. Was this justifiable? Had I been dismissed for simply working at my desk all day? I couldn't help but think so, although I was only interpreting it on my own. I finally decided that I'm not going to argue with him, and that I was going to quit anyway. Understood. I'll pack my things and leave. Good. That'll be a big help. Honestly, it was so frustrating having someone like you around, just staring at a computer screen all day. With a mocking laugh, Charles added insult to injury, leaving me no choice but to bow my head and head back to my desk to gather my things. Whatever happens after this, it's not my problem anymore. Charles, satisfied with himself, watched me pack up, his smirk intact. I'm sure that after I leave the company, Charles will report to the president, Mr. Underwood, with various excuses about my resignation. Even then, the reason why I had to keep staring at my computer during work hours will eventually become clear. After finishing, I walked out of the office without a word. I glanced back briefly after leaving the building, but as expected, no one followed me. If anything, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders as I walked away without hesitation. Then, my eyes drifted toward the rival company next door, and I froze. In my confrontation with Charles, I'd completely forgotten about Mark's offer. I pulled out my phone from my suit pocket and opened Mark's contact info. He had said I could call anytime, but would now be okay? After a moment's hesitation, I made up my mind and dialed Mark's number. Mr. Underwood, I'd like to discuss something with you. Meanwhile, Charles was visiting the president's office to report my dismissal. What is it? Let's hear it. Well, Kevin, who was part of my team, submitted his resignation today. I've come to deliver his resignation letter on his behalf. Charles, with a triumphant look, handed my resignation letter to Mr. Underwood. However, the letter wasn't written by me, and it was a forgery Charles had penned himself. While he could declare my dismissal all he wanted, he lacked the authority to officially terminate me. So, he decided to exploit my absence, framing the situation as if I had voluntarily resigned. Of course, Charles was confident that the disappearance of a single employee wouldn't be enough to change Mr. Underwood's mind. But Kevin resigned? That's absurd. Surely you tried to stop him, didn't you, Charles? What? Charles was stunned as he watched Mr. Underwood's face turn pale the moment he learned about my resignation. He hadn't expected such a reaction and fumbled for an excuse. Of course I did. I tried my best to convince him, but his decision was firm, and I couldn't change his mind. Mr. Underwood, showing no suspicion toward Charles's act of feigned regret, immediately took out his phone to call me. Seeing this, Charles began to sweat nervously, realizing his lie might be exposed. Please don't answer his call, he silently pleaded. No answer. Charles, why don't you try calling him as well? Charles felt a brief sense of relief when I didn't answer the call, but it was short-lived as Mr. Underwood urged him to try contacting me as well. Feeling displeased and irritated by the suggestion, Charles couldn't hide his frustration. Mr. Underwood, why are you so determined to stop him? Honestly, our company will be fine without him. You wouldn't understand, but Kevin has been protecting our systems from bugs. You shouldn't say things so carelessly. Charles's face flushed bright red after being called out by Mr. Underwood. It seems he utterly despises me, even in my absence, for causing him such embarrassment. While Mr. Underwood hurriedly dialed my number again, Charles ground his teeth in frustration. He appeared humiliated, realizing that I was more valued than him, despite his position as a senior manager. Mr. Underwood, there's an emergency. Please come quickly. At that moment, a female colleague appeared suddenly, looking unusually flustered. Sensing something was wrong, Mr. Underwood hurried to the location she was leading him to. Charles quickly followed, only to find that the female colleague was leading them to his department. Several of our computers have started experiencing bugs, and we can't resolve them. About 100 bugs had cropped up across staff systems, leaving everyone in a state of panic. Some staff couldn't send critical data to clients, while others found their systems completely frozen. We can't get anything done like this, Mr. Underwood. If we don't send this data by the end of the day, we'll be in serious trouble. Staff turned to Mr. Underwood one after another, desperate for help. Seeing the chaos, Mr. Underwood could only hold his head in his hands. Charles, witnessing the disaster he had caused, finally realized the gravity of his actions. His face turned as pale as a sheet. What? How did it come to this? As Mr. Underwood buried his head in frustration, Charles frantically tried calling me again, but I still didn't answer. By then, I was already in contact with Mark at the rival company, and I had no intention of returning the call. Charles began to grow suspicious, realizing I might be ignoring him on purpose. His frustration boiled over. He's deliberately ignoring my calls. A colleague, watching Charles yelling into his phone, couldn't help but speak up. Well, of course. You told him he was fired earlier, didn't you? What did you just say? Mr. Underwood whipped around to face the employee, his expression filled with disbelief. Charles, panicking, shook his head vigorously. No. I don't remember saying that. Don't bother lying, Charles. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Everyone here heard your conversation with Kevin. Hearing those words, Charles glanced around the department and noticed the harsh stares from the employees. It seemed they realized that the series of bugs that started appearing after I left the company were likely due to their decision to drive me out. Things were getting worse for Charles, and his panic was palpable when Mr. Underwood confronted him. What's the meaning of this, Charles? You just told me earlier that Kevin voluntarily submitted his resignation, didn't you? There's a deeper reason for that. As Charles began making excuses, Mr. Underwood finally lost his temper. How dare you act without my authorization? Go and bring Kevin back immediately. Yes, sir. Under the scathing reprimand, Charles bolted out of the office. When his calls went unanswered, Charles decided to head to my house to persuade me in person, but I was one step ahead of him. Bet Charles is banging on your door right about now. The one who said that was Mark, who had just joined me after receiving my call earlier. We were at Mark's house. After being fired by Charles, I had contacted Mark, who was off work, and he had invited me over. Honestly, just imagining that is pretty funny. I couldn't help but laugh at his comment because it probably wasn't far from the truth. Judging by the incessant calls from both Mr. Underwood and Charles on my phone, it was easy to imagine the scene. I explained the situation to Mark, and he allowed me to stay at his place tonight. This was to ensure that neither Mr. Underwood nor Charles would find out where I was. My boss was thrilled to hear about you. He's arranged for an interview tomorrow. Really? That's incredible. I can't thank you enough for all you've done. Having decided to accept Mark's previous recruitment offer, I had asked to interview with his company. Mark, understanding the circumstances, immediately contacted his boss, who quickly approved the plan. I didn't think they'd make a decision so quickly, but we're all overjoyed to have you join us. Stay here as long as you like, not just tonight. Thanks, Mark. I mean it. You've done so much for me. We laughed together as we said that. The moment felt just like our high school days, unchanged by time. I couldn't help but feel, from the bottom of my heart, that friends are truly invaluable. Apparently, Mark's company already had 2 engineers like me. With me as the third, it would ease the workload and allow everyone to take more breaks. No wonder they wanted to finalize my hire quickly. For me, the thought of having colleagues who understood my work was a huge relief. I had always been the only engineer, with no one to share the load or understand my challenges. To top it off, I don't want to be told again that I'm a salary thief playing on a computer. After the interview, I was officially hired by the rival company and began working alongside the other engineers. The new job was nothing like my previous one. My skills were respected, my salary was higher, and I was finally satisfied. Although Mark was in a different department, my days were far more fulfilling. I doubted Charles or anyone from my old company could imagine I was now working right next door. Rumors reached me that their systems were plagued with bugs, rendering the computers unusable. They couldn't recover their data, missed deadlines, and suffered contract cancellations one after another. Eventually, the staff began submitting mass resignations. As for Charles, he apparently showed up at my house, but since I wasn't home, he couldn't find me. Frustrated, he returned to the office, where he faced even more scolding from Mr. Underwood. Later, it was revealed that Charles had forged my resignation letter, leading to his immediate dismissal. He probably never imagined he'd be the one getting fired. Stripped of his pride, Charles left the company in disgrace. Being the only failure in a family of elites, Charles faced relentless criticism from his relatives and was ultimately disowned. Shunned by the industry, he scraped by with part-time jobs, trying to survive. Meanwhile, the company itself couldn't recover. Without enough staff or a way to resolve the bugs, it went bankrupt. 1 month later, at my new workplace, I was finally finding a renewed sense of purpose in life. The mistreatment I had endured at my old job now felt like a distant memory. "You're so much brighter now than when we reconnected, Kevin," Mark said that with a warm smile as he looked at me recently. I hadn't noticed the change myself, but he was probably right. Now, I get to do the work I love every day alongside my colleagues. All of this is thanks to Mark for inviting me to join his company. If I hadn't reconnected with you, Mark, I doubt I'd be where I am today. Thank you again. With gratitude in my heart, I resolved to keep pushing forward in my work. If dedicating myself to my job could be my way of repaying Mark, then I vowed to continue doing so with all my strength.